We're so back, or at least that's the phrase that they tell me the youngins are saying these days. Welcome back to the channel. The Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology wanted to do a video covering this topic specifically, whether or not a Latin-Rite priest can refuse on matter of principle to celebrate the Novus Ordo liturgy. This has actually come up in the last few decades because there have been some in the Latin-Rite who say, nope, I will only do the Missal of 62. And as a matter of principle, I refuse to do the Novus Ordo. I refuse to celebrate it. And that has caused some problems, especially in circumstances where the bishop is having a chrism mass and brings all of his priests to concelebrate with him, a very ancient practice, concelebration, where all of the priests and the bishop come together and celebrate the Eucharist. Well, there have been some who do the Missal of 1962, what's often called the Latin Mass, and they say, well, as a matter of principle, I will not celebrate this liturgy and I will not concelebrate this Novus Ordo Mass with my bishop. So we're not talking about circumstances where maybe a priest just doesn't know the Novus Ordo because he's only been trained in the Missal of 1962. So he doesn't refuse to say the Novus Ordo. He just doesn't know how to say it. That's a different matter. That's a different situation. That's not a refusal on matter of principle. But we're talking about circumstances where the bishop expects one of his Latin Mass priests to be there to concelebrate with him in this Novus Ordo Chrism Mass to show their unity with their local bishop. And the Latin Mass priests in some cases has said, no, we're not going to do this. And that has caused a bit of a scandal in the Catholic Church, what you might call a Latin Mass scandal. And we're going to talk about that because it actually just came up once again recently when Pope Francis met with the Fraternity of St. Peter priests. I actually covered that the other day. They had a great meeting, but there was a part of that meeting that the society, or the priestly fraternity, I should say, released to certain groups of people, but did not release this part publicly. And I didn't report on it because it wasn't public information at the time. But now that I see it is already publicly available, okay, well, since it's already out there publicly, I might as well comment on it. And I saw specifically where Peter is posted it. So it's like, okay, well, if this is already out there in public discussion, it's fair game to address. So I'm going to share my screen and kind of show you what the Holy Father told to them in reference to this matter. You should be able to see it right around now. The Pope was very understanding regarding the difficulties encountered in various dioceses, particularly in France. He rejoiced at the fruitfulness of the Fraternity of St. Peter in terms of vocations and was deeply impressed by the vitality of our houses of formation. And that's great. I'm glad to hear that there are good vocations there, that they're growing, and that he was pleased with the results. That's awesome. He invited the Fraternity of St. Peter to continue to build up ecclesial communion evermore through its own proper charism, that is by, of course, celebrating the Missal of 1962, the Latin Mass. That's their charism, and the efforts of each of its members, expressing his wish, while respecting the freedom of each individual priest, for the concelebration of the Chrism Mass, or at least for the presence and Eucharistic communion of priests at this ceremony. So if they don't know how to celebrate the Novus Ordo, at least be present to show their full communion with their local bishop at the Chrism Mass. And that's a very reasonable expectation and wish for the Holy Father to request in light of what I'm going to show you here in a moment. He encouraged continued communication with the dicastery for institutes of consecrated life and societies of apostolic life. The audience lasted around 25 minutes. Again, that's not the public version of what was released for reasons unknown to me. The society, I'm sorry, I keep saying society, the fraternity released this information, to a select group of people, but publicly it put out the other statement that I read on the show the other day. But again, since this has now been made public, I might as well comment on it. So, in regards to the issue of refusing to celebrate or even participate in any kind of way with the Novus Ordo liturgy, is that in fact a possibility for a Latin-Rite priest? Well, let me remind you of what unity means in the Catholic Church. This is coming from the Catholic Encyclopedia, and this should be well known to anyone who has been catechized in the basics of Catholicism. The Catholic conception of the mark of unity, which must characterize the one church founded by Christ, is far more exacting. Not only must the true church be one by an internal and spiritual union, but this union must also be external and visible, consisting in and growing out of a unity of faith, worship, and government. Those are the three things that are essential to manifest church unity. We have to be united in the same faith, governance, the government of the church, and worship. If we're not united in any one of those, we're not united as one church. So there has to be unity on an essential level with all essential doctrines, with matters of worship, essentially speaking, and government. Now, obviously, we have different rites in the church. Not everybody has to celebrate the same rite. But then the question is, can someone say, on a matter of principle, I refuse to say this particular rite approved by the church? Sneak peek, the answer is no. It's one thing to say, well, I am a priest of the Byzantine tradition and I say the Byzantine liturgy, so I don't do the Latin-Rite, either Novus Ordo or Latin Mass. I mean, I've been trained in this ritual and that's what I do. Okay, that's fine. But no Byzantine priest should say, on a matter of principle, I would never go and worship with a Latin, and I would never in my life ever be willing to learn the Latin ritual. If one were to say that, they're not united in worship with the Latin rite of the church. So that would be a problem. So again, it's one thing to say, well, hey, I'm not trained in this. It's another to say, on a matter of principle, I refuse to do this. Now, let's take a look at what Pope Benedict said specifically about this issue. He says, there's no contradiction between the two editions of the Roman Missal. I believe that many people don't actually believe that nowadays. I've noticed there's a lot of people out there who think that there is a contradiction between the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo. They say, nope, these contradict each other. They're not the same. Essentially speaking, it's not the same rite. Well, you know what? They're contradicting Pope Benedict XVI. Specifically, in his letter to the bishops on the occasion of the publication of the apostolic letter Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum on the use of the Roman liturgy prior to the reform of 1970. He says there's no contradiction between the two editions. That's a whole show right there. In the history of the liturgy, there is growth and progress, but no rupture. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, which also then means communion in the hand can never be considered sacrilegious, because that it was held as sacred. But that's a whole nother show, and I've done multiple shows on it. You're welcome to watch them. But what he's talking about specifically here is, well, you can't say like the Missal of 62 is somehow not sacred. Of course not. No. Anybody who says that's ridiculous. And it might even be schismatic. In fact, it is certainly sacred. What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. And it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. Which is why the church has not entirely forbidden the Missal of 62. From day one, it's always made exceptions and allowed for it. And Pope Francis, to this day, allows for the Missal of 62 in certain cases with the diocesan priests under certain conditions, and especially with the Fraternity of St. Peter. So it hasn't been entirely forbidden, contrary to what people on social media tell you. In fact, Pope Francis has made provisions for it. And it makes sense that you can't entirely forbid it all of the sudden. Now, maybe over a long period of time, you can discontinue it in the same way that we've discontinued many rituals historically. But you can't do it all of a sudden. That doesn't show continuity. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the church's faith and prayer, and to give them their proper place. Now, here's the part that's most relevant to us in today's show. Needless to say, in order to experience full communion, so full communion with each other, you remember what's necessary for that: unity in faith, worship, and governance. To have that full communion, the priests of the communities adhering to the former usage, so the Latin Mass priests, the Fraternity of St. Peter priests, priests of the communities adhering to the former usage, cannot, as a matter of principle, exclude celebrating according to the new books, the Novus Ordo. As a matter of principle, they can't say, I refuse to celebrate the Novus Ordo, or I refuse to even attend a Novus Ordo liturgy. I refuse to go to my bishop's chrism mass as a matter of principle. No, that you can't do that, because you're no longer in full communion if you do that. Why? Because we have to be united in faith, worship, and governance. Again, it's a different question of whether or not they can celebrate it. Perhaps they don't have the training. But at the very least, they can attend and participate in some kind of capacity. But to refuse outright as a matter of principle, you cannot do that, as it is schismatic. You're not in full communion with your local bishop, and therefore you're not in full communion with the Pope either. So that's why it's really important for us to be very solid on this point of chrism masses and celebrating the Novus Ordo. If there is a priest out there who says, I just refuse on matter of principle to celebrate it, well, you're talking to a schismatic priest at that point who's not in full communion with the Catholic Church. Now, I'll also bring this up, and where Peter is addressed it as well. This was a dubia submitted to the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, responding to dubia on Traditionis Custodes. And one of them says this: to the proposed question, if a priest who has been granted the use of the Roman Missal of 1962, so the Latin Mass as it's called, if they don't recognize the validity and legitimacy of concelebration, so celebrating with other priests, refusing to concelebrate, in particular at the chrism mass, so at the chrism mass of their bishop, can he continue to benefit from this concession? What concession? Well, the use of celebrating the Missal of 62. Can they continue to enjoy that concession of celebrating the 62 Missal? Answer: negative. Negative. It cannot be done. And by the way, this is magisterial. However, Before revoking the concession to use the Roman Missal of 1962, the bishop should take care to establish a fraternal dialogue with the priest. So instead of just automatically kicking the guy out of the priesthood, try to talk to him. Find out if there's something we can do to fix this. Establish a dialogue with the priest to ascertain that this attitude does not exclude the validity and legitimacy of the liturgical reform, the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, and the magisterium of the Supreme Pontiffs. Because if it does, then we have a massive problem. And to accompany him towards an understanding of the value of concelebration, particularly at the Chrism Mass. So try to help them. Try to accompany them. And it gives an explanatory note. Article 3.1 of the Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes requires that the diocesan bishop to ascertain that the groups requesting to celebrate the Roman Missal of 1962 do not deny the validity and legitimacy of the liturgical reform dictated by Vatican II and the magisterium of the Supreme Pontiffs. That's one of the conditions. St. Paul forcefully reminds the community of Corinth to live in unity as a necessary condition to be able to participate at the Eucharistic table, right? And if, as a matter of principle, one is refusing a liturgy approved by the church, then we're not united in worship, and therefore we are not one church. In the letter sent to the bishops of the whole world to accompany the text of the Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes, the Holy Father says, because liturgical celebrations are not private actions, but celebrations of the church, which is the sacrament of unity, they must be carried out in communion with the church. Vatican II, while it affirmed the external bonds of incorporation in the church, the profession of faith, the sacraments of communion, affirmed with St. Augustine that to remain in the church, not only with the body, but also with the heart, is a condition for salvation. Serious stuff. The explicit choice to not take part in concelebration, particularly at the Chrism Mass, seems to express a lack of acceptance of the liturgical reform and a lack of ecclesial communion with the bishop. So it's schismatic, both of which are necessary requirements in order to benefit from the concession to celebrate the Missal of 62. However, before revoking the concession to use the Missal of 62, the bishop should offer the priest the necessary time for a sincere discussion on the deeper motivations that led him not to recognize the value of the of concelebration, in particular in the Mass presided over by the bishop, which I just find incredibly ironic because concelebration is more traditional than low masses, for example. So a Missal of 62 priest, the Latin Mass priest, will do a low Mass. But a low Mass is more innovative and less traditional than concelebration. Now, I don't have a problem with low Masses. I don't have an issue with them at all. I think they're good. I'll defend them. But the point is, if we're going to claim tradition, well, concelebration is apostolic in nature. He should invite him to express in the eloquent gesture of concelebration that ecclesial communion, which is a necessary condition for being able to participate at the table of the Eucharistic sacrifice. This is necessary. So, there are other resources, of course, where the church has discussed the necessity of unity in faith, governance, and worship, but I think that this is sufficient to just establish the point that, as Benedict said, as a matter of principle, one cannot refuse to celebrate this liturgy. But there could be certain impediments, there could be certain circumstances that would make it to where a person can't celebrate the Novus Ordo, but they're not refusing to do so on matter of principle. And this is what Pope Francis was wanting to make sure with the fraternity, that there's no problem there. So he once again reminded them of his wish, and hopefully there won't be any issues. And, the priests of the fraternity will be willing to celebrate with their bishop, and we can be united in faith, governance, and worship, and there won't need to be any further restrictions of the Missal of 62. One of the reasons why we're seeing restrictions being imposed on the use of the Missal of 62 is precisely because there are people who are weaponizing it and using it to fight against the church itself. I hope that we don't see that anymore, because if we continue to see that, well, people are just proving Pope Francis right with Traditionis Custodes. I hope they, in fact, prove them wrong and say, no, we're not weaponizing this thing, and we're going to obey lawful authority. And I think if that's done, then I imagine the restrictions will ease up. Anyways, hopefully this was helpful. If it was, hit that like button and especially the subscribe button. And of course, check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology to help me continue to produce this content. I really need your assistance in continuing to produce this show. So if you are willing to consider supporting me monetarily so that I can continue to put out this content, please go ahead and do so. And you'll also get access to extra patron-only content. So, all right, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, and hit that subscribe button. God bless. Hey, friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com. Have you ever noticed that certain Catholic teachings are classified differently? For example, some are called dogmas and others are called doctrines. And then a denial of one of these teachings might be called heretical, while a denial of another might just be called an error. In reality, there are many classifications to various teachings that may be found in the Catholic Church. In my course, The Theological Notes, I offer a crash course on this system that will prepare you to identify a teaching's classification more easily. And I'll also help you determine what level of assent or adherence you are required as a Catholic to give to a particular doctrine. So, if you would like to take this course, visit reason.podia.com. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy, and engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.